good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network, or APAN. Today we are honored to have Col Tyrell O. Mayfield and Lieutenant Colonel Nathan K. Finney join us to discuss their book, Redefining the Modern Military, the Intersection of Profession and Ethics. Their book was selected by the USAF Commander for the 2020 Commander's Reading List as part of the Ethics, Leadership, and Governance collection. Colonel Mayfield is a United States Air Force political affairs strategist. He is also a founding member of the Military Writers Guild and co-founder, editor, and board member of the Strategy Bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Finney is a United States Army strategist and Goodpaster Scholar pursuing a doctorate in history at Duke University. He is also a founding member of the Military Writers Guild, co-founder of the Strategy Bridge, and co-founder of the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. Nate and Ty are with us today in their personal capacity, and their thoughts and views do not represent the Army, Air Force, or Department of Defense. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us today. It's really good to see you.
Thanks for having us, Kyle.
Yeah, really glad to be here. Thanks for your time.
Great. Well, we certainly appreciate it. The topic of ethics and professional conduct is a very important issue to United States Special Operations Command. The edited collection in your book does what I consider an exceptional job of expanding and refining the ideas on the role of ethics and the military profession in the 21st century. It's a very unique collection of chapters and offers varied perspectives on the profession of arms. But I'd like to begin my questions for you today by asking you about the book's subtitle, and it's called The Intersection of Profession and Ethics. Can you please explain the interrelationship between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyle. Really appreciate it. That's actually one that even after about a year and a half of talking about the book, nobody's asked, so I appreciate that.
Good.
So, the short answer is, since the profession of arms' primary function is the ethical use of force in the furtherance of national interests, they're absolutely linked, right? It's a defining feature that they intersect in what we do. And that's ultimately what led to the writing of the book, was this idea of how do you match together, how does ethics and the profession match together? And what kicked it off was Professor Pauline Shanks-Curran, who at the time was a professor at Pacific Lutheran University, now at the Naval War College, used to prep for her classes by posing questions on Twitter. And she put out a tweet about her class and people's thoughts on ethics and military ethics. And that got a lot of conversation, including Ty and myself jumping in. That led to a lot of really good conversation on Twitter that then we were able to harness into articles for the Strategy Bridge. And as we got those articles and published the articles, we realized we needed more than just 2,000 to 3,000 words for each of these arguments, trying to look at that intersection. And so we asked a few, about 10 or 12 of the best articles, the authors, if they could expand that. And that's ultimately how we ended up with the book. And so the intersectionality of profession ethics can be seen in all the contributions of the book. Two examples that really kind of jump to my mind are Mike Denny's chapter 4, where he discusses the role of judgment and ethical decision-making when it comes to breaking or bending the rules, and the knowledge of when you can do that, when it's appropriate to do that, being a defining feature of the profession. The other chapter is Dr. Rebecca Johnson's chapter 6, which directly addresses the ethical requirements of the profession itself. So each of these 2 chapters, but really all the chapters, kind of struggle with what we do as professionals to determine the right frameworks for understanding both topics.
It's good. I think I'll follow that by saying that another angle that we can address, or another opportunity we can use to look at this intersection of profession and ethics, is actually highlighted for us in our oath of office that we take as officers. We swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and everybody remembers this part of our oath, but we also swear to well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which we're about to enter. And this office is not a physical space. It's not a place where you go to work in the morning. It's a moral office. Our decisions as officers, as professionals in the profession of arms, have moral impacts. They affect human beings, be they the subordinates that we're leading, opposing forces, enemies of the state, civilians that are on or adjacent to the battlefield. And so every decision that we make has human impacts and therefore has moral implications. And ethics is how we think about moral issues, how we come to make moral decisions. In the profession of our calling, to control state violence, the application of violence on behalf of our state requires ethical education. It's something that I think is in many ways profoundly lacking in our professional development and our professional military education, and in our commissioning and PME programs. It's something that we can work on, and certainly a point that is highlighted in our oath of office, and that just reminds us that our decisions have moral implications, and ethics are central to understanding how we come to those decisions.
Well, yeah, it's a great point. And you mentioned ethics, ethical development in our PME and our accession programs. And I actually have a question on that a little bit later on. So we'll hold that thought for now. But I think it's clear, it's very necessary that we clearly define what these words are and what they mean. And so that's why it was sort of my lead-off question. But related to that, there's another term that I'd like to get a little clarity on. And in fact, Colonel Mayfield, you just used it in your response. You said the profession of arms. Right. And we often hear that phrase, profession of arms. But you know, I'm not 100% sure that everybody really understands what that means. So I'd like you to explain what the profession of arms is and why it is important.
Okay, so this is a great question. Traditional professions include medicine, law, clergy, and there are some foundational ideas that go into defining these professions. So first you have to understand that professions have a couple core functions or core attributes which are common across all of them. They provide a vital service to society, which society cannot do for itself. Professions develop and work with expert knowledge in the service of their clients. In our case, as a profession of arms, our client is actually the Constitution of the United States, which is an inanimate object, but is representative of the citizens of the United States. Professions, other professions, you know, doctors, obviously, their clients are their patients, and they serve individual patients in support of the entire society. So clergy, law, medicine, those relationships are pretty clear. Ours is a profession of arms. Is a little bit unique, and so that bears some consideration. Professions earn and maintain the trust of their clients. This is a condition vital to the relationship, and it's built on the ethical and effective use, application, as it were, of their expert knowledge. In our instance, it's the application of violence on behalf of the state. And then finally, professions and professionals exercise relative autonomy in the application of their expertise. So we have this relationship of trust with our client, the citizens of the United States, and we are granted autonomy to practice our profession. There is oversight, but it's not, it's direct oversight, but it's not so much that it intervenes in our decision-making at the tactical, operational, or strategic level so much. And then we are obviously led by civilian leaders. So there is that direct oversight and that direct relationship back to our client. So I think when you go back, so that's kind of to look at what the profession of arms, its attributes, and how it relates to other known professions. And I think if you go back to the Korean War and you look at the Vietnam War as well, both of these conflicts were followed by periods of introspection. So following the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict, you both had academics who studied the military, the relationship with civil society. Samuel Huntington, Morris Janowitz come to mind. They attempted to define the profession and then place them within the context of our civil-military relationship. Huntington largely looked back over time using kind of the Korean model or the Korean conflict as the most recent historical experience and tried to set the framework for defining the profession. Janowitz also sought definition, but Janowitz looked forward to try and decide how militaries might look in the future, including being smaller, being more professional, being more representative of a democratic society, and more representative of its population. Others have since attempted to define and describe and refine this concept of the profession of arms and its place in society, whether they add to Huntington or Janowitz or try and redefine it based on the circumstances of today. More contemporary thinkers on these issues have been Sir John Hackett, Dr. Abbott, Dr. Don Snyder, Colonel Don Snyder from the Army's Center, Nate, help me out.
Center for Army Profession and Ethic.
CAPE. All right, Center for Army Profession and Ethic. Thank you, CAPE. And then Dr. Don Snyder moved down to the Army War College and continued to teach and work on these issues there. So, and then also you have the military working on these as well, right? General Westmoreland, following the Vietnam, implemented a sweeping review of professionalism within the service. So I think one thing that we've identified and noted in this cycle, right, is a period of conflict when the military is actively engaged in conflict, when it returns home following a period of peace. And in this period, we get introspection, reflection, the further professionalization and refinement of the military service. And then you enter the cycle of conflict again, and it begins again. And so I think Nate and I kind of have argued, and I think this book makes that point as well, that we have had those periods following Korea, following Vietnam, following the first Gulf War. But since the global war on terror, since the events of 2001, there hasn't been this respite. There has not been a prolonged period of peace in which we as a profession of arms have had the opportunity to do our reflection and our continued professionalization. And I think we have to learn how to do that while engaged in conflict and while under an increased operations tempo.
Yeah, thanks very much. There's one other attribute that I want to make sure that we bring out of what I would consider, a profession of arms, and like you mentioned, the medical community and such, but it's self-governance. And
Yep,
we have the Uniform Code of Military Justice in which to direct our behavior. And just like the medical community has their own, guidelines in which to follow. So I think that is also an important aspect that I just want to mention that makes the military a profession.
That's right. And I think this falls under the autonomy perspective, right? Professions are also self-policing, right? And this is the point that you're getting at, right? And
right.
our core ethical foundation that we use to do our own self-policing is the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this comes to an interesting point, right? Where if you ask a medical professional what is their ethical obligation, and they'll all tell you, first, do no harm, right? They understand this piece. This is kind of their professional statement. And the profession of arms is unique in that we don't have a unifying statement like that we can all ask or that we can all respond with. And so that's just an interesting differentiation, I think, with our profession and that of the medical community. But you're absolutely right. Self-policing, self-governance is essential to the identity of a profession.
And just to jump in on that, self-policing isn't just UCMJ, right? It's norms and standards that we expect or we train and educate our uniform members to meet. And I think as we're talking in the context of this review by the SOCOM commander, which I think you'll get to, I think that's exactly what that is. This is a time of reflection. Even though SOF forces around the world are still extremely busy, he's taking the time to do this self-reflection and do this self-policing in order to make our forces more ethical, more effective, and as a part of that autonomy, to ensure we are taking care of ourselves so we don't lose that autonomy and others, civilian officials above us, come in and make changes that we should be doing on our own.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I want to thank you for bringing that out. You mentioned the comprehensive review, so I'll just go ahead and ask you that question. The USAF commander recently ordered this comprehensive review of Special Operations Forces, or SOF, culture and ethics. The review was just recently completed in January of this year, and it offered 16 recommended actions. But as you know, SOF is truly a joint force with different service cultures, which we're going to address a little bit more later on. But I'm curious what you think about such a broad organizational undertaking as opposed to something a little bit more specific, maybe service specific or individual agency efforts.
Yeah, that's a great question. And changing the culture of an organization, let alone the culture of a profession, it's no easy task, right? I mean, it's one of the hardest things you can do is change a culture. And when it comes to SOF and the review of SOF and assessing how, after 2 decades of war of employment in a very high up tempo and very specific ways overseas, it's natural there's some point of reflection and adjustment. And USAF isn't the only one. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Australia on a fellowship in 2017, and the then Chief of Army, General Angus Campbell, who's now the Chief of Australian Defence Forces, was in the process of doing the same kind of assessment and reforming for the SAS and commando units there. And my sense was, having kind of briefly looked over US SOCOM Commander's Review and having had conversations while in Australia, it seems to be for similar reasons. Patterns of behavior, patterns of standards and norms naturally change all the time, but particularly when you send uniformed members to do their job overseas. And so I would recommend to USSOCOM, if they haven't reached out to the Australians or others who I'm sure have done the reviews as well, I'd highly encourage that. Because they had some great initiatives going on when I was there in 2017. But getting back to the service cultures piece, you're absolutely right that one of the key challenges is the fusion of many organizational cultures. That's USSOCOM in particular. I mean, all of the joint commands, but particularly SOCOM, who has so many joint forces with different capabilities, need to look at it. And, that is an aspect that in Redefining the Modern Military we look at, right? We deliberately brought on people to look at specific service cultures. With Brian Lisley, Dr. Brian Lisley looking at the Air Force, Steve Foster, a fellow strategist of peer of mine, looking at the Army, and Will Beasley looking at the Navy, and each of them taking a piece, trying to see how those specific cultures developed, why they developed the way they did, and what that meant for both the profession and ethics.
So I think last fall, General Norty Schwartz, the former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, asked Nate and I almost this exact same question at the Army Navy Club. And I think the issues that Nate had pointed out are relevant to the conversation here. And the recommendation that we look at what our coalition partners and peers and allies are doing is one that we should certainly take on board. But I think we might also look at what's not happening in US SOF. And so oftentimes we focus on the shortfalls, right? And they certainly need to be addressed. But we can look at the absence of shortfalls in other SOF communities and ask the question about what is different about those communities within SOF, what is different about those communities' culture, what is different about their indoctrination, what is different about their ethical frameworks, their decision-making process that has prevented or perhaps insulated them from some of these shortfalls that we have seen in some of the SOF communities. So we should certainly be focused on the problem. We must acknowledge it. We have to learn to address it. But we also, I think, do ourselves a disservice if we don't look at the absence of those things in some communities and think about the lessons that can be learned there. In the end, isolation is kind of a necessary attribute about much of what SOF does. SOF is a community within a community. And as you pointed out, SOCOM is a collection of isolated communities, right? So there's a lot of culture conflict within there. But even the SOF truths acknowledge that SOF forces and SOF missions require conventional support. And SOF is a means, it is not an end to itself. So I think if we look at the service's general purpose forces, they're different. There's more transparency and oversight in line units than there is in SOF units. I think that's a reasonable argument to make. There's also a different level of training, a different level of screening. But I think in the end, this leads to accountability in different ways. I think perhaps the SOF community might be well served to break some of their current paradigms and consider rotating SOF personnel back out to general purpose force units in a deliberate and purposeful way, right? For broadening tours that help reinstill institutional value that have without question lapsed and been replaced by other less ethical practices perhaps in some SOF communities. This is not to say that there haven't been ethical lapses in general purpose forces, because there absolutely have. But I think if you're looking to maintain that connection between SOF forces and their larger parent organizations, that rotation back to an institutional position in a general purpose force can serve to, in a way, to re-blue or re-green someone and help them get back in touch with service identities, service cultures, service ethical frameworks, and just serve as a good checks and balance. It's good for the general purpose force too, right? You bring that experience and some of those leadership traits and experiences back to the general purpose force. I think it's certainly something that should be considered.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I appreciate you bringing that out. I would imagine that there would be some in US SOCOM who might fight you on that particular thought, but
well, I'm certain there are, right? But obviously the status quo has got us where we are today. So we have to think about breaking paradigms. We have to think about doing things differently. I mean, guys go in the Ranger Regiment and they bounce between three battalions for their entire career, and you have to ask yourself: is that specialization, is that niche specialization serving the greater force, right? The institution itself. And so you have, I think Ranger School is an example of that. That's a qualification requirement for regiment, right? If you're an E5 or a sergeant or above, but that's also an initial qualification that all kinds of soldiers and airmen and Marines go through, that then they take back to general purpose forces. So that's one example, right, of dipping into that community just for a qualification. I understand that. That's different than being in a regiment, but then taking those skill sets back out to the larger community. The Air Force does this in some instances with different airframes. Folks go into SOF and they go back out to the larger institutional community. This is how we develop NCOs and officers. This is, senior NCOs spend time on the line. They walk the trail. They're drill sergeants. They're drill instructors. They go out and do recruiting tours. They go teach at PME, and then they go back to their communities. This is the way we cycle folks through the institution. I think we leave SOF out of this paradigm at our own risk, at our own peril.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So now I'd like to ask a follow-on question regarding the culture and identity of special operations forces. And we've sort of touched on it in our conversation so far, but there's an increasing amount of SOF stories in books and movies and television shows. SOF in general are often portrayed as, fearless, action-oriented, mission-driven. They need to get the mission done despite, facing tremendous odds. And I'm not trying to belittle this at all, because this is actually very true in many instances. But furthermore, SOF by their very nature are members of a very select group of people with long and proud lineage. So my question to you is, do you think any of these conditions are counterproductive to good professional and ethical conduct?
So I think we should seriously consider this question, whether or not it's counterproductive to the profession, to the professional and ethical conduct within SOF. I think that might be a stretch, right? And I'll say that for this reason: the personnel who operate in this community are specifically recruited, they're screened, they're tested, they're selected they're trained, they're qualified. You don't go from watching Zero Dark 30 and playing Call of Duty 3 to wearing a trident or a green beret in a matter of weeks. There's an entire process and enculturation and screening here. So in short, I don't think that the personnel who are in the community are necessarily affected by the media, which surrounds and in many instances glorifies the community. But that raises a second, in my mind, a more pernicious question. And that's whether or not the books, movies, interviews, stories, and general deference given military members, but especially SOF, isn't bad for civil military relationships, isn't bad for our autonomy, isn't bad for the status of our profession. And I think that in many instances, military personnel have been glorified, and in some instances, overappreciated for their service. It's not to say that what we do isn't important, but we've seen a whiplash from the Vietnam generation. There are still folks who came home from an unpopular war to a hostile domestic environment. And there are still folks who remember that. And there are citizens who were part of that process. And I think our country went through a grieving and a kind of a reconciliation process. And it killed the draft with the professionalization of our force. And we now have an all volunteer force. And that piece has been different. And the nation has been really good about separating the warriors from the war, if you will. But I think that the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction at this point in time. And I'll argue that nothing good comes from the hagiographic relationship between citizens and their professional military members. And this placing of military members on a pedestal where they can do no wrong, and SOF in particular, I think receives a lot of attention in this aspect. I've cautioned other officers that I've worked with and that I've led and mentored about this double-edged sword of military discounts, of veteran parking, of all the other prerogatives that have been extended to members of the United States military. And I have cautioned them about not getting used to being thanked for your service. There's probably a day coming when that's going to end. And we as military professionals need to be prepared for that. These pendulums swing, they go from one extreme to the other. And I think you may be starting to see the pendulum come back in some aspects in this country. I'm agnostic about that. I think that's the cycle of things. But I think as a profession, we have to be prepared for that. And we have to understand that that doesn't change our status. It doesn't change our duty. It doesn't change the ethical and professional requirements that we've signed up for. So it's kind of a long answer, but I think these cultural artifacts, if you will, be they pop culture, media, do have an effect on our relationship. But whether or not they have a direct effect on the ethical participation or ethical activities or decision-making within the force, I think that might be a stretch.
Well, yeah, thanks very much.
I'll jump in with one quick thing, and I actually might throw it back to you, Kyle. That's, one point, a lot of that media was focused on one specific aspect of Special Operations Forces, right? The Navy SEALs, where there's a lot of movies, a lot of books coming out about the Navy SEALs in particular. I'd be interested, real quick, just to ask you if you've seen any kind of impact on this type of media, this type of environment within SOCOM, within the Special Operations Forces themselves, as they do seem to be heavily skewed towards one of the components versus the others.
Well, yeah, I appreciate you asking. My role in US SOCOM, though, has been more recent. I was a member of the General Purpose Forces during my career, my military career. So when I joined SOCOM, I joined as a faculty member. But my experience in JSOU has been tremendous. The people I've worked with, I've not seen any sort of negative aspect to that particular issue. But it's hard to say because I'm not embedded in the small teams. I'm not embedded at a soft base. But Colonel Mayfield, you mentioned earlier the soft truths, which I was impressed that you worked that in there. So my next question is, it's about soft ethical decision-making truths. And given the complexity of the ethical decision-making in soft environments, we understand that they operate in very austere environments, many times with not very clear guidance, and they have situations that develop. So two of my colleagues at the Joint Special Operations University, they proposed 6 soft ethical decision-making truths sort of as a pragmatic anchor for members to sort of fall back upon. So I'm going to pause a moment. We're going to put the soft ethical decision-making truths up for our audience to read. So gentlemen, as fellow academics working in the ethics of the profession, I'd like to hear your thoughts on these 6 truths.
Yeah, I think they're certainly a great set of guidelines. I mean, they all make sense and they seem very applicable to the SOF forces. One additional aspect we might throw into the mix is the idea that this ethical decision-making is something that must be exercised and learned, right? It's something, thinking ethically or thinking critically about your role as a professional in a profession of arms shouldn't be something one only does at a moment of crisis or a moment of contact. It must be continually engaged. So Ty and I have talked about this many times. You kind of think of it like physical training, right? You wouldn't expect your SOF forces to perform at their peak physically without spending time exercising, or peak tactically without going through tactical drills and training. Nor should we expect professionals to act ethically without exercising those decisions through education in PME, through ethical exercises, whether in PME or in training simulations that kind of stress those ethical decisions. By exercising those moral and ethical judgments frequently is how you build up that so-called muscle of ethical decision making. So I just add that kind of active aspect to it as well.
Yeah, so I think reviewing these ethical truths, if you will, I think the idea that ethical decision making and moral character are not fixed is absolutely true. We see this especially in our newest accessions, right? Across all the services. It's an all-volunteer force. We bring in citizens who come to us with the ethics and moral character of our nation, of their individual communities. And these are generally aligned with those of the services, but there is an acclimation period. I mean, if you can imagine a Venn diagram, when you come to the service, your ethics, your moral beliefs, there will be some overlap. You are coming from the society from which we're drawing folks. But over the period of time, your ethics and morals become more and more in sync with those of your service. We assume the ethics and morals of our institution, or we come to a crossroads of incompatibility. SOF is a community within an institution, and it cannot have different ethical and moral standards than the institution. And ultimately, our actions as professionals have to be congruent with and support the moral character of our nation. The absence or lack of emphasis on ethical training in our commissioning and PME programs, perhaps even within the SOF community in their assessment, selection, training, qualification programs, is something that I've come to see as a shortfall in my own development anyway. I mean, I can speak to that as an individual. And I believe we can't wait for the institution to develop us. The institution has got to do a better job with developing us. But we have to seek this development on our own. That's part of the reason why we wrote this book. Ethical training, especially for SOF, must become as emphasized as any other SOF effort. Dr. Pauline Shanks-Corinne, she has a chapter in the book as well. She's an ethics professor at the Naval War College. She's got a bunch of tools and training materials on her personal website that are available for commanders, for first-line leaders, for company grade officers, field grade officers to pull down and work through problem sets with their teams and to build these reps and this muscle memory in. So it's something that we have to do as individuals, this peer-to-peer training and peer-to-peer development, but it's also something that the institution has to look at and begin to find ways to incorporate it across the continuum of our experience and careers as officers and service members.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question now about one of the chapters in your book, or actually use the chapter as the premise for the question. Well, I enjoyed many of the chapters. I'm a retired member of the Air Force, so I read with interest the chapter about the Air Force, and it's saying that there's a lack of culture and lack of identity in the Air Force. We've heard in the Marines, every Marine a rifleman, and that's a motto, or it's something to live by. It's something to hang their hat on. But the chapter discussed how members of the Air Force did not see themselves as an airman first. They would see themselves as a pilot first, or a maintenance officer first, or I'm a logistician. And trying to drive in that thought that I'm an airman is difficult in the United States Air Force. Now, relating that to United States Special Operations Command, we have a similar issue. Of course, we have Navy SEALs, Army SF, or Special Forces. We have Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, and Air Commandos, all under the same command. But one very big difference is our SOF operators work in very small teams. And as I mentioned, often in very austere conditions, difficult circumstances, maybe lacking, clear guidance. And I'm wondering if this creates its own subculture. So I'm curious what you all think, if this creates a tension between loyalty to the team as the first order, and then loyalty to the broader organization as secondary, when maybe it should be the other way around. So what are your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It could be an aspect of the function, though not exclusive. Much of their time, their function is to perform discrete, highly dangerous tactical actions that require immense technical and tactical capability. Working in small teams, this could justifiably narrow that field of vision, as you mentioned, to what's required to get that job done capably and as safely as possible. Now, I'm certainly not in a position to describe effects of loyalty or not, but it would likely require significant leadership from the small group level all the way up to the USAF commander to connect their intent, their vision, their organizational culture, ethical expectations. And just because different cultures come into play, which is what Brian Lasley's chapter talks about, or each element's focus may be slightly different, doesn't mean the organization as a whole can't function or doesn't function well. The diversity of capabilities, cultures within SOCOM is a huge benefit. It brings its own strengths and weaknesses that others can support and overcome towards the intent, as you said in your question, is kind of clarity of the mission. And so I think ultimately, Brian's end message in his chapter on the Air Force, when you really dig down, is that each aspect of the Air Force has its own spin on a culture. And what is required is not focusing on a one-size-fits-all fix, so not necessarily trying to enforce that, but rather understanding how to balance and manage each of the benefits of the different aspects of the organization as a whole.
Yeah, so I think Dr. Lasley would argue that the Air Force does indeed have a unifying culture, and that it's one in which we all serve within the Air Force, but as you pointed out, we identify with our core career fields or our specialties first. So I think there's a number of reasons that the Air Force is unique this way. It has a lot of very technical career fields, much like the Navy does. It's a very technocratic service, although all the services are increasingly becoming more technology-based. But to your point, we do lack a unifying identity. It's difficult. And I think that's what Dr. Lasley argues is our strength, actually, and that's diversity. As you pointed out, every Marine is a rifleman. Everyone in the Army handles a rifle a couple of times a year. Everybody in the Navy ends up on a boat or a ship at some point in their career. They always some kind of basic level training and experience that ties them to a core identity. The Air Force, we literally have Air Force bases without runways, with no planes on them at all. And so it's difficult when a large portion of your force never sees aircraft on a daily basis. It doesn't have a tangible access and personal touch to what it is that you're trying to sell or brand as a core identity. It's a very unique service challenge. I think there's some other things too. We're the youngest of the services. You could argue that we've completely erased our history and our heritage. We have total amnesia about everything that happened before September of 1947. And I think we've done ourselves a disservice in that. And we are in so many ways ahistorical. But our diversity of thought, our vastly different approaches to solving problems does create agility, does create a spirit of innovation. And I think that's what Dr. Lasley is arguing in that chapter, is that left to their own devices, these communities within the Air Force are completely capable of solving their own problems. Sometimes their problems may be so technical, as in the Raptor experience or the Raptor case study that he identified in there, that the other communities within the Air Force may not be helpful in solving that problem. Now, left in isolation, subgroups will develop their own culture. That goes back to the thing that I was recommending earlier about you can't leave something alone. There has to be a rotation. There has to be a cycle in which you bring in fresh thinking and which you pull people out of that community, expose them to the institutional cultures, and then put them back in, just to serve as that checks and balance. There's a happy medium here. There's a hybrid here. We have to do some work, and it's something that we need to work on for sure.
So I'll just point out real quick, you're no longer the younger service.
Oh, thank you. Well, we have our own Marine Corps now, so.
No, I'm glad to hear you say what you did. USSOCOM, of course, with all these very different organizations under, as I mentioned, the SEALs and the Special Forces. It is definitely a subculture, and then, like I said, with the small team mentality, one must understand where the loyalty lies. So I think it's an important issue, at least maybe to think about and to talk about in the classroom setting, as these people cycle through their professional military education or through JSOU courses, to put in a little plug for JSOU. But my next question is about PME, and you've both mentioned it already in your responses, but based on your research, and of course you're both military officers, so based on your practical military experience, do you believe we have the appropriate amount of emphasis on military professionalism and ethical conduct early in military careers, such as officer accession programs or basic training for enlisted? And now, based on what you said, I don't think we do. So how do we balance ethical and professional development when we are trying to build tactical experts early in their career?
Yeah, so this is a question Ty and I do get quite frequently, and I think he and I differ a little bit slightly in the answer, so that should make it a little more interesting. So personally, for me, I think the professional and ethical foundations built early in the military career, most especially since I've experienced it in officer education, is actually pretty strong. Could there be more practical scenario-based training, getting those ethical reps we talked about earlier? Absolutely. However, the core of leadership education and training in particular, in addition to the heavy significance and conversation around things like oath of office that I mentioned earlier, is based around the fundamentals of acting professionally and ethically. And we're teaching somebody to be a leader. We're teaching them to also act professionally and ethically. Now, there's always room to improve, but I personally think the fundamentals are there. What we should focus on is not just adding another block of instruction to PME or another part of, another hour of sergeant's time to do this, but rather that we can highlight the ethical and professional aspects of what we're already doing and making it more intentional and more clear as to the professional and ethical aspects.
Yeah, so I think Nate's he's walking the right path here, and this is the right answer. We have a lot of emphasis about working in a profession. We tell everybody you're working in a profession. We tell them they're professional. We demand professional conduct and behavior. So we have the how and we have the what, right? We drive that home, but we don't talk about the why. And this is what Nate is talking about making it deliberate in the development. So I think we have some of the fundamentals there. But this goes back to my observation about our ethical development coming up short for officers and really for our entire force. I would argue self-development here is key, and we can only really do self-development to a point. In the end, we need others to help us. I think peer-to-peer development is even more important than the institutional development, and that's going to require a cultural change in our services where we give permission to subordinates to do peer-to-peer development. We set the expectation that they do peer-to-peer development. The institution has to provide the tools, the framework, the boundaries, but we as professionals have to always be sharpening our own skills. One of the attributes of professions is that they develop and work with expert knowledge. If you get some ethical training or some discussion on what it means to be a professional at your commissioning source, and then the next time you discuss it is at your captain's career course or at squadron officer school, I have to ask, like, what's happened in the intervening 4 or 5 years? And if you show up at the War College at the 19 or 20-year mark, or Command and Staff College at your 15-year mark, and they drop Dr. Don Snyder's book, The Future of the Army Profession, in front of you, you're going to struggle. It's too late at that point to begin thinking about the attributes of your profession. You're already 15 or 20 years into a career. And that, again, that's part of why we wrote this book. This is a bridging tool, a stepping stone to greater knowledge. We wanted to provide leaders and officers, senior NCOs, civilian leaders with a tool they can pick up as a primer on the profession, something that's digestible, that can be read in small groups and discussed. And the book is a mechanism for peer-to-peer development, and it's a great tool for leader-led professional development sessions, commissioning programs, PME. It's built to start the conversation and serve as a bridge to the work of other scholars. And so we identified this, Nate and I both having, attended PME and done PME, like that when you come to this conversation late in your career, there's something missing. And we feel like this book is designed to help identify that earlier on, to begin the conversation earlier on, and work the why into the how and what of what it means to be a professional and work in a profession.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a really good response. And I'd like to add that, Nate, I agree with you that just adding another block on ethics and professionalism in some level of PME is really not the answer. It has to be interwoven in almost everything we do. And Ty, as you say, there's these periods of time in between PME that you're not getting exposed to it as you should. So again, it almost has to be something that's always thought about, always discussed, and like you say, the peer-to-peer discussions. I think that's very good.
Yeah. So I'll follow up with just one point here, and that is, if you see another block of instruction pop up, if you see another congressionally mandated CBT, that is a sanction that will be levied against the profession where we came up short. Every time you log in and complete a CBT that's congressionally mandated, you're being sanctioned. Your autonomy is being restricted, and your status as a professional is being sanctioned and being questioned by your client. That's the feedback mechanism right there. So when we fail to police ourselves, we are policed by others. And I think that the SOF community is looking at this right now, and they want to address this ethical shortfall, and they want to address these problems. And these questions that you're asking about professionalization and peer-to-peer development are absolutely critical, because if we don't get this right as a profession, we will be told how to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe your book being on the 2020 Commanders Reading List is part of this, is that, we are trying to, yours is not the only book on professionalism and ethics that was chosen, but we are trying to get our command to read a little bit more about it, to learn about it, and obviously to live it. So that's a very good point. Thank you. So gentlemen, as a follow-on to that last question, many SOF professionals don't enter into special operations until a little bit later in their career. So they've got knowledge on one shoulder and experience on the other shoulder. But what approaches are recommended for strengthening the ethical development on that other shoulder? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about this before, right? It's not an either-or proposition. They need to be tactically proficient, but also ethically proficient. And one way to do this is to focus on, like I mentioned, I think to the last question, is focus on the fundamentals of leadership, but building on those fundamentals of leadership by highlighting and foregrounding ethical decision-making, and what is likely is more direct discussion on those ethical elements in those leadership conversations than anything beyond that.
Okay, so I think ethical development is understanding why we make the decisions we make. So we have to ask ourselves what questions or what models rather are we using. I think the soft ethical truths are an important first step, but we have to also give our members the tools required, right? And they have to understand the different models. So are they always making utilitarian decisions? Are they always making character-based decisions? Are they always making principle-based decisions? So when you're dealing with the soft community and these austere environments, high ops tempo with little oversight, these are things that they have to be sensitive to and they have to understand. So understanding what lens we most often use to make decisions. We all have a lens that we default to. And then being able to switch and see our challenges and issues through another lens to argue another course of action is fundamental to making good decisions. Good leadership teams do this. Sometimes we look at a problem through multiple lenses and we get the same answer, right? That's it's very reassuring, but it's not always the case. When commanders do this, command teams do this when they're working disciplinary issues. Leaders often talk about good order and discipline, balancing right and wrong, balancing accountability. These are literally the lenses that go with this, are literally utilitarian, principled, and character-based. The goal here is, to hit that sweet spot and address as many or all of the desired outcomes provided by these different lenses. But our subordinates and our military members have to be familiar with these frameworks, and they have to understand them. Just like they do troop leading procedures or basic battle drills, they have to understand these different decision-making processes, these different lenses, and be familiar with those tools and know which one to use in which situation. They can't be created in a time of contingency or emergency.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I do want to ask one more question about PME, because, I work at JSOU, and so we're very much education focused, but last month, which was May of 2020, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs released a new vision statement regarding professional military education. It was not a long document. It was about 10 or 12 pages or so. But the document discusses how to develop today's joint officers for tomorrow's way of war. Now, as I read through the document, and especially in preparation for this particular interview, I was looking for, what does it say about ethics? What does it say about professionalism? It was only, ethical development was only mentioned one time in the entire document. So once again, do you think there's enough emphasis on professionalism and ethical behavior in PME for both officers and enlisted? And how do we make it better without just adding, as Nate said earlier, adding one more block of instruction?
Yeah, so I've read through that document. I thought it was quite fascinating that they were able to get a vision through and signed by all the chiefs, right? I mean, it had to be pretty tight to even at just 10 pages, had to be pretty tight for all of the services, including the new Space Force chief, to sign off on it. So it's very good to see that they are interested in signaling to all of the services the importance of PME. Now, as I previously mentioned, ethical and professional acknowledgement is inherent to how we educate our leaders, though it may not be highlighted enough. This could be a similar reason the Joint Chiefs vision, kind of explicitly mentions ethics only once, as you said. I'd wager all the signatories would say ethical behavior is inherent to being a professional. Ethics is a part of leadership, which is one reason why it might have been, a little not deliberately put out there. My sense is also that most military members also see ethics as action, not something that necessarily can be quote unquote studied, right? So while there's certainly room to debate that point, an approach focused on highlighting moral and ethical behavior is a part of leadership education already in PME, already in our training, already in our education, mixed with scenario training forcing ethical decisions and reflection might be the best approach to addressing this issue. So kind of playing on some of those perspectives and paradigms on how our leaders think about ethics already is probably the right way to go versus just highlighting the word ethics or, like you said, putting another block of instruction.
Right.
I think we might, if I might add here just briefly, I think We might also go back to PME and ask ourselves, what is it that we really want from PME? If we have, if everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. And so if you want folks coming out of PME with a more focused on ethical development, ethical decision-making, then we have to spend more time on that. And that comes, it's a zero-sum game. You get 1 year. So you've got to figure out what you want to get out of that. And so you go back and look at our PME institutions, and they're all issuing master's degrees. Is that why we're sending people to PME? If we did away with that framework, would it free us up to add other things, to specialize more? And maybe we allow folks to go into PME, and we allow some people to take an ethical decision-making track. Some people take a strategy track. Some people take a modernization track. And maybe we can build things into our PME process that way. So I think incremental change is difficult with institutions. Institutions are resistant to change. And so we might be at an inflection point where a bigger change is afoot. So I think it's a good opportunity.
Great, yeah, that's a very interesting point. Thank you. I know we're beginning to approach the end of our time, so I'm going to ask you one final question before I give you an opportunity to provide closing comments. But this is an opportunity for you to tell us why we should read your book. So if you were to give our audience, 3 golden nuggets for this book, what would they be?
Okay, so I'll go first here. So first one is self-development. This is critical to our success as a profession. We cannot wait for the institution to develop us. We have to make time to do so ourselves. Peer-to-peer development is probably the single most important and most effective thing, and it can be done at all levels. The second thing I would argue is publication. Professionals work with and develop expert knowledge. So part of this is publication of your written thoughts. We have to find time to hone our craft, and not just the technical and physical aspects of it, but the cognitive ones as well. Publication is critical to that peer-to-peer development I mentioned earlier. When you struggle with a problem, when you apply your own training, your education, your experience, you put those thoughts to paper, you actually sharpen your own skills, you hone your own abilities, you develop your own arguments, you set the stage for the conversation that follows, which is driven in the development of that expert knowledge. You're developing new knowledge every time you write something, and then that conversation that follows helps the peer-to-peer piece, and publication is essential to that. And then lastly, the reason I think you asked us to come here today, and that's ethical development. We have to do a better job of exposing our members to different ethical decision-making models, to understanding how other people and other cultures make decisions, what other people, allies and adversaries alike, what do they value, what do they fear. This is a big hole in my own professional development. That's something that we as a profession have to work hard to get the right repetitions in. We have to be as familiar, as I said earlier, with these ethical frameworks as we are with troop leading procedures or battle drills or emergency procedures in the cockpit. They have to be drilled into us and repeated. It has to be deliberate and purposeful. We have to understand the how and the why as well.
Yeah, so my 3 nuggets are things we've talked around quite a bit tonight. First one, reflection. While op tempo's high, has been for years, especially for SOF, we're currently in a lower level of engagement. We should leverage in order to reflect on ourselves as professionals in our own decision making. What we could do better as individuals, what we could do better as commands, and how we can get better for the future. Second one is judgment. So one of the most thought-provoking chapters in our book is Mike Denny's chapter on professionals know how to break the rules. And as he mentions in the book, acting ethically and performing as a professional is not about black and white, following easily established rules. It's about judgment. Situation drives ethical decision-making, and a professional has to make the right and ethical choice. And sometimes that can mean bending or going against established norms or rules. And the last nugget is culture. Culture affects how we function, but as professionals, we must also understand it's our job to shape the culture ourselves. Ethical failures most frequently occur as the extension of organizational culture. If you allow a standard to slip, it continues to slip, continually until establishing a lower standard. However, you can also work it in a positive manner. We're correcting the men and women around you, teaching them the right way to conduct business, creating a higher standard, and holding those in the organization to it can positively impact the force. So each of those pieces are talked about in some manner or fashion in the book. And so I just highly recommend kind of looking at those aspects.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I think this has been a very good conversation, and I very much appreciate it. So before I conclude, though, do you have any final comments for our SOCOM audience?
So I'll just, again, thank you for your time and your attention today. This book is available, right? And the authors, the contributors, the editors are available as well. So if you pick it up and you engage with the text and you have questions, you have concerns, please reach out, find us. We're happy to continue the conversation. We're happy to talk to organizations. So I've traveled and spoken at the Naval War College, or spoke at the Joint Staff for the Texas Army National Guard. So we're willing to engage your audiences. We're willing to engage your communities. We're willing to engage you at the individual level and help you do the work that you need to do to continue to just advance the profession and work on your own self-development. So we're super happy about SOCOM's interest, about SOCOM, and I think the book is timely. So that piece is good. And we're hopeful that it makes an important and lasting contribution. So I'll just say thank you for your time and your interest. And we look forward to hearing from you in your community.
Yeah, I'll just echo Ty's comments. Thanks so much for inviting us to be here. We're really proud and humbled that the book was picked by the U.S. SOCOM commander. And the defining feature of the book is this element of reflection, and that we need to take the time to reflect and figure out how to do things better. So the fact that fits with what the U.S. SOCOM commander is doing as well is just, it's been great. So thanks for having us here, Kyle.
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned earlier, professionalism and ethics are very, very important to United States Special Operations Command. Your book, titled Redefining the Modern Military, I think it works to understand the roles of ethics in the military, as well as how to better develop individuals in our very lethal profession. And furthermore, in my opinion, I think your book is very good for every member wearing a uniform to pick up, to read, and in order to better develop their own understanding of modern professionalism, because of the varied perspectives that the book in the chapters offers. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time and expertise in joining us today.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Sure. For our online audience, if you have feedback on this session or on any Think JSOU activity, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. And also, if you have any nominations for future interviews, you can contact us at the same email address. I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library or on one of our social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or APAN. Additionally, the US SOCOM Library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books, such as this book, or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. And of course, you can always check out upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University, and I want to thank everyone for watching today.